This video didn't turn out the way I wanted it to. It isn't really being made because of the reason I wanted it to be. I actually ended up buying a Farsight and some battle suits because I went into my local store and was made aware that there was a painting competition happening. And I'd never actually entered a painting competition, so I wanted to do something. Now, for a while, I've actually been wanting to paint some Tau in the original Ochre scheme, which is mainly because that's one of the armies that really got me into 40k when I was a young child. Funnily enough, random little tidbit, I also found out that that Ochre scheme comes from when Tau were released. At the time, obviously Star Wars was also quite popular, and the Tau scheme was made to kind of emulate the baseline battle droids from the prequel movies. So if you didn't know that, there you go. But anyway, having Farsight, I didn't want to do Farsight, just the model itself in this scheme, because that would be blasphemy. Now, a lot of people have called this model blasphemy anyway, but I wanted to convert him a little bit. So I took the base model and just cut off the tabs for the legs and arms, just so as I could repose them. And I purchased some 3D printed bits from Taro Model Maker to replace the arms. So you can see this is how I've positioned the legs, just in slightly different positions. I've done a little bit of just kind of dry fitting and placing them next to each other here and there, just to get a gauge for the pose that I want. Now that I'm happy with that, I can glue the legs together and secure it once and for all. And this is kind of how he's standing. I wanted him to be kind of perched upwards on a rock. Now for the arms, I didn't want to do too much work and have to redo the entire upper arm, so I clipped off the forearms and just shaved down the circular nubs so as the parts from Taro Model Maker would just kind of slide right in there. Now securing those with super glue, because of course these other parts are resin, and I decided to go with one gun arm and one kind of Onaga gauntlet, I suppose is what it's meant to be. Because again, this isn't Farsight, this is my own kind of standalone stand-in converted commander. I built the body as per normal, because it actually does feature just the regular Tau iconography. Shaved off the tabs for the arms that kind of locked them into a specific position and glued them in. When it came to the shoulder pad, I wanted to remove just as much of the Farsight feel as I could without going too far into the model, so I shaved off the kind of samurai rivets on his shoulder pad. And I tried this stuff for the first time. It's like a Tamiya modeling clay paste stuff. I'd never used it. It's been in my drawer for a while. I honestly didn't even know what it was like. It's not the right stuff to use for this application, but I mean, it worked enough. I kind of shoved it into the hole purely because the Farsight head, the neck is quite long, whereas I just wanted to use a more traditional battlesuit head, and the necks are quite shallow on those, so I needed something just to fill out that hole. Again, you can see there's a little bit squeezing through, but you can't see it for the most part, so it's okay. I can live with it. I then built out a base with some pine bark and some spare bits I had laying around, one of those being a Taunar head, a little fin, and then just blended it all together with some basing grit and sand, pinned the model to the base, and started getting to work. If you watch any of my videos, you'd know by now that I start most of my models this way. I undercoat it with black primer, and for this guy, I did want him to be ever so slightly chipped, but also this color works for the scheme that I'm going to be building up anyway, so I base coated it in Vallejo Charred Brown. I then sprayed it with AK Interactive's Heavy Chipping. I prefer this stuff because I don't have to rub so hard to get any of the subsequent layers of paint off. If you've never used chipping fluid, it's essentially like the old hairspray technique where you spray it down, paint over it once the chipping fluid's dry, and then once you've given the paint enough time to dry so you're not going to just wipe it off. You can rehydrate the paint, and that activates the chipping fluid underneath, which actually allows you to flake off any paint between the layer underneath and the layer on top of the chipping fluid. Now, as for the scheme for this guy, I'm going to be thorough because I've had a lot of people ask me exactly how I painted the tail yellow, because this is a scheme that a lot of people try. A lot of people can't necessarily emulate the exact colors. I think I did okay. I don't think it's perfect per se, but I'm happy with it. I wanted to stick with all Games Workshop colors to keep it kind of traditional. Normally I would play around with different brands and whatnot, but I base coated the model with Tau Light Ochre. I then added highlights with an airbrush with Ungor Flesh. I then used Scrag Brown, very watered down, and added in shadows. And then for edge highlighting, I used the same Ungor Flesh and then added slightly more bone white to that Ungor Flesh just for the tips. Just got to interrupt this video really quick for the obligatory sponsored segment, and today the sponsor is me. If you want to help out in creating these videos, you can check me out on Patreon. Over there's some cool rewards like the in-video shoutouts, the ability to submit pics for me to feature and comment on your paint jobs at the end of videos, the ability to send me stuff to actually have me paint for a video, and the chance to actually get models that I paint in videos every now and again, like the Cerastus Knight that I've done before, or the Leviathan Tyranids that I painted previously. So I've got to give a shout out to Drew and Pac-Man for this video. Thank you for your support. So if you're feeling ultra generous and want to support, links are in the description as always, but I'll stop taking up your time. Let's get back into the video. But just once the airbrush layers are done, you can see I spray the model with water just to quickly rehydrate everything, and then I will load up a shallow kind of stiff-ish brush with water and just gently rub away at the paint, and you can see it's just pulling little chips of paint away from most of the edges of the armor, which of course is kind of naturally where you would get chipping, so it's a very easy way to do it. Now, I actually did all of these steps way too fast. I pretty much did them in one session, where normally I would want to leave more time between. Also, before I forget to mention, I am very sorry for the focusing on this. Halfway through the model, I actually switched to filming it a different way with a black background, because for whatever reason, I've just been fighting my camera lately and I can't seem to get it to focus on the model as opposed to the background. But I filled in the chips that kind of went back down to the plastic with just a brush and some charred brown again. I then sprayed the entire model with Liquitex's polyurethane gloss varnish, and I mixed up a oil wash. I have a video that I posted, a couple of videos again, all about oils, so if you want to know kind of a bit more about how I use them, why, and how to get good effects with them, check that video out. But this is using Absalon 502's Faded Dark Yellow oil, which is essentially just orange, with just a tiny smidge of burnt umber mixed in, just because the Faded Dark Yellow wasn't quite dark enough. So you can see with a nice glossy, smooth, slippery surface, all I have to really do, and Tau Armor is the perfect application for oil pin washing. All I have to do is tap it into a crevice and you'll just see the oil expand throughout the entire recess. It's a really fun, really easy, and extremely satisfying process. No oil wash is ever perfect though, so I use these little makeup sponges and I just dampen them a little bit with my odorless white spirit, and then I go around and just clean off, you know, just wipe away any excess oil that's kind of spilled out. One of the beautiful things about oil is its working time, so this is super easy to do. You could come back a day or two later and do this. While the model was gloss varnished, but once I'd given the oil a little bit of time to dry, it was a good time to add some transfers. Normally I wouldn't use chow transfers because the transfer sheets actually kind of annoy me. I would much prefer the majority of them be, you know, white and black. I don't know why they've gone with the majority of them being red. Or maybe, you know, 1/3 red, 1/3 white, 1/3 black. It would be much more useful. But in this application and for this one specific color scheme, I guess, other than the other box art color scheme, which is, you know, white and red, these transfers work perfectly. So I slapped a few of them around, and then after giving it a matte varnish with AK Interactive Ultra Matte, this is how he's looking. So now it's time to go in with a brush again. So I'm using Ungor Flesh, as I mentioned before, and just adding some edge highlights. I'm not being perfect with it. I'm kind of avoiding some of the areas where I've already added chipping, but I'll hit most of the upper facing hard edges. While we're doing this, I'll take the time to say thank you guys for watching my videos lately. The support I've been getting both here and on Instagram, if you don't follow me on Instagram, make sure to do that, has been nothing short of astounding, and it's kind of you guys that give me the motivation to keep making these videos. A good percentage of you that watch aren't actually subscribed though, so if you're just not thinking about it, make sure you subscribe. The next step to this, and I kind of just hit the more upper edges and the inside parts of long flat edges, is just adding some white into that Ungor Flesh and adding a second edge highlight. Then just to make these transfers filled a little bit lived in, I go in with a little detail brush and just add some charred brown chips over them. Now for the worst step of any model, let alone a Tower Battlesuit, is blacking out all of the armor. For this, I use Pro Acryls Black. This is a black that I've been kind of really enjoying lately, and I don't see any reason to switch from it or try any others. It's matte enough, but it's got enough of a shine to it. It flows well, the coverage fantastic. I'm a fan. So at this point, I took time to kind of step back and assess how he was looking, how everything came together. I find the black adds a nice bit of contrast and kind of really allowed me to actually assess whether I got the color right. Throughout all the previous steps, it kind of always looked like, you know, too much of a work in progress for me to properly judge it. But at this point, I was quite happy with the color. So I decided to keep going with him. Now, using white ink through an airbrush, I use ink because it's very opaque, it's very thin, and it flows very well through an airbrush, unlike just regular acrylic paint, so you don't get that splattering and spluttering. I add some very quick and easy highlights to all of the armor. Now, if I were to do this model again, I wouldn't actually do this step. I would probably just stick to more of a traditional highlight, maybe just be a little bit scratchy and rough with it. But I wanted to give the legs, you know, all of these kind of quote unquote metal parts, more of a lived in, worn feel. So I went in with a small makeup brush and just using some cold gray, I added some very light edge highlights. It was then time to do some of the details. So I kept Farsight's little, I don't know what you'd call this, tabard thing, and just base coated it with Baneblade Brown from Games Workshop. Now, this was the point where I was getting frustrated with the camera, I think because I'd recorded something for Instagram and I realized at that point just how bad the focus was. But I masked off around the model and then just added some quick airbrush highlights No, I lied before. I'm using Baneblade Brown for this. So I used a darker brown. Let me look next to me, actually. I can do this. I used Steel Legion Drab as the base coat. So Steel Legion Drab is the first color. Baneblade Brown is the second color through an airbrush. Then using a makeup brush again, just for some scratchy highlights, I added some bone white into Baneblade Brown. And then using a very rough, old kind of destroyed brush, I went in just with bone white and added some more scratchy highlights. I then started the first step. Now I went back and forth with doing this and a couple of other different things, but the first step of what I wanted to be some blue glow on the kind of jetpack vents. So I used white ink again for the same reasons as with an airbrush. It's opaque, it's thin, and I filled in the vents there. So you can see how in one layer it's covered all of the interior parts of the vents, the deepest recesses, but it's actually blended out and left the upper edges still a little bit black. While that was drying, I went through and did a little bit of detail work. So I went in with some corn red and just base coated a couple of the panels, and then just added a highlight, a quick edge highlight with Evil Sun Scarlet. Nothing crazy, but just adds a little bit of variance to the model, and I'm a fan of it. I ummed and ahed on how to do some of these circular parts, because I'd done the big ones on the backpack black, and I considered doing them all black, but I ended up going with some gold. So using scale 75, I used Viking gold, and then just a traditional Agrax Earthshade wash, and then added some highlights to the upper edge with some scale 75 Elven gold. I'm not actually blending or doing an edge highlight, I'm just kind of tapping away and adding more paint to the top and less paint to the bottom. I then mixed together some contrast paints. So I used Guilliman Blue, Athematic Blue, and some Vallejo Flow Improver all together just to thin it down, just to give it a blue with a tinge of kind of greeny teal to it. Then just with a very quick dry brush, and to add some extra contrast, I went over the very tops of these vents with some black. I then actually went back and gloss varnished this because I realized I wanted to add some transfers, because the transfer sheet features some nice lettering to it. So I've hit the model with some microsol and am now just laying on some transfers. Because the shapes are kind of weird, once this has dried, I paint over it with some micro set, which allows the transfer to conform and the backing paper to kind of suck in a bit more to the different shapes. And then once that's done, I added a very quick oil wash into the little recess, just some brown, and then matte varnished it to give it the same finish as the rest of the model. Now, since this is dried, I've gone back to the vents. This was all painted in one session, so I'm kind of going back and forth. I mixed up a very thin white oil wash and just tapped that around the edges. It looks a lot more overpowering when you watch me paint it, but as it dries, it recedes and sinks back into the edges. So it adds just a tiny bit of white into the deepest parts to make it look, you know, like a white hot glow. Now that the oil's dried, I do the same thing that I did with the armor, and I just, with a dampened makeup sponge, I just clean off the top part so there's no white on there. Getting close to the finish line, it's time to paint the lenses. So I went with blue on this. It's not the actual traditional color. Normally they'd be red, but I liked the blue theme kind of contrasting against the red armor panels and markings and going along the power from the jetpacks. So base coating the entire lenses with dark Prussian blue. I then added just kind of a volumetric highlight to the bottom with some Games Workshop Calidor Sky, and then slowly added more and more Temple Guard blue to that Calidor Sky and pulled those highlights closer to the outside edge of the lenses. Then to finish it off, just add a white dot to the top, just as a kind of like little reflection glow. Then finishing up the base, and this is what we're left with. Now, this was a failure. Why? I'm incredibly happy with the model actually. I genuinely love the way the scheme came out. It reminds me of my childhood and what got me into 40k in the first place, and it's made me want to start an entirely new project and do an entire Tau army in this scheme. But I didn't finish it for the video that I wanted to make. I wanted to enter this into a local store competition and film that and see how it went, but I just ran out of time. I didn't come anywhere near to making it actually. I finished the model about a week after the submissions closed. I am happy that I continued with the model, and I'm happy that I completed it regardless because it was a fun project, and lately I have been getting gradually more and more burnt out. So I've been enjoying just doing these kind of single models that I've been wanting to do. I've got a couple of other projects coming up. I'm making a diorama that I've been wanting to make for a long time, so I'm very excited about that. I'm actually working on that right now. So yeah, I guess if you're ever feeling burnt out with your painting, maybe just pick a model that you've seen on the shelf or that you bought a while ago as a treat, and just spend some time on that and just kind of learn to enjoy painting again, because it can turn into a bit of a monotonous chore from time to time. But anyway, if you liked this video, if you learnt anything from it and would like to see more from me, make sure you subscribe, like the video because that helps me in the algorithm and stuff, and I will see you guys in the next one.